Vegan, 1956. Kevin was not what anyone would call a promising student. Born in the industrial north of England where coal mines and cotton mills defined life, he slouched through school with minimal effort and maximum disinterest. His teachers wrote him off as lazy, unmotivated, destined for factory work like most boys from Wigan. When he scraped together just 3 O-levels, the basic educational qualification of the era, it confirmed everyone's low expectations. No university would touch him with those grades. No prestigious career path would open. He was, by all conventional measures, unremarkable. But Kevin had one advantage that grades couldn't measure. He was profoundly unhappy with the idea of spending his life in Wigan's factories. The prospect of decades breathing coal dust or working textile machines filled him with quiet dread. So in 1956, at an age when most of his classmates were starting apprenticeships in dying industries, Kevin walked into an RAF recruiting office and signed up. Not as a pilot, that required education he didn't have. Not as an officer, unthinkable for a working-class kid with 3 O-levels. He joined as an apprentice, the lowest rung of the Royal Air Force ladder. The RAF apprentice scheme was designed to take young men with limited education and turn them into skilled technicians. It was hard, demanding work. Classroom instruction combined with practical training, military discipline imposed on teenagers who often resented authority. Many washed out, but Kevin, the boy teachers had dismissed as lazy, discovered something unexpected about himself. When the work actually interested him, when it had purpose beyond memorizing facts for exams, he excelled. He came top of his apprentice course, outperforming boys with better educational backgrounds and more prestigious schools behind them. His reward for this achievement was posting to RAF Street Magon in Cornwall, assigned to supplies. Not engineering, not aircraft maintenance. Supplies, managing inventory, ordering parts, tracking equipment. It was administrative work, the kind of posting that crushed ambition. Kevin found himself in charge of the clothing stores, issuing uniforms and boots to airmen, checking inventory lists, filling out requisition forms. It was respectable, necessary work. It was also soul-destroying for someone who had joined the RAF to escape boring, repetitive labor. But fortune, as it often does, favored someone paying attention. Kevin was in charge of clothing stores when pilots came through for flight suits and equipment. He saw them, talked to them, learned about their world. More importantly, he learned about the pathway to becoming a pilot and discovered it wasn't entirely closed to him. The RAF had routes for enlisted men to become officers and pilots if they showed aptitude and determination. It was a narrow pathway, competitive, difficult, but it existed. Kevin began working toward it with the same focus he'd shown as top apprentice. He studied, prepared, applied. When opportunity came, and in the RAF of the 1950s and 60s, opportunities did come for those willing to seize them. He grabbed it. Through what he would later describe as a fortuitous route, Kevin transitioned from managing clothing stores to pilot training. The lazy schoolboy from Wigan with 3 O-levels was going to learn to fly. RAF pilot training in the late 1950s and early 1960s was intense, unforgiving, designed to produce combat-ready aviators who could fly anything from nimble fighters to massive bombers. Candidates progressed through stages: basic flying instruction on propeller trainers, advancement to jets, specialization in particular aircraft types. The washout rate was high. The RAF couldn't afford to waste resources on pilots who lacked skill, judgment, or the temperament for military aviation. Kevin not only survived the training, but thrived. He demonstrated natural aptitude for flying, good hands on the controls, spatial awareness that couldn't really be taught. More importantly, he showed the judgment and cool-headedness that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. When emergencies arose, and they always did in training, Kevin responded correctly. When instructors threw complex scenarios at him, testing his decision-making under pressure, he made good choices. He was becoming what the RAF needed: a reliable, skilled pilot. His early flying assignments built experience across different aircraft types. But in the early 1960s, Kevin received the posting that would define much of his career. He was selected to fly the Handley Page Victor, one of the RAF's V-bombers. The Victor was part of Britain's nuclear deterrent force, along with the Avro Vulcan and the Vickers Valiant. These aircraft represented Britain's ability to retaliate with nuclear weapons if the Soviet Union attacked, the cornerstone of deterrent strategy during the Cold War. The Victor was a remarkable aircraft. Designed in the 1950s, it featured a distinctive crescent wing shape that gave it both high-altitude performance and surprising maneuverability for such a large aircraft. It could carry nuclear weapons to targets deep inside the Soviet Union, flying at altitudes above 50,000 feet, where few fighters could reach and surface-to-air missiles struggled to engage. Later in its service life, the Victor was converted to tanker role, becoming the RAF's primary aerial refueling platform. Flying the Victor gave Kevin perspective on the weight of nuclear deterrence. These weren't training flights or peacetime maneuvers. They were practice for missions that, if ever flown in anger, would mean World War III had started. Victor crews trained constantly for routes into Soviet airspace, for low-level penetration to evade radar, for the procedures to arm and drop nuclear weapons. They knew their survival chances, if war came, were essentially zero. The missions were one-way trips. But the hope, the entire point of deterrence, was that the credible threat of retaliation would prevent war from ever starting. Kevin flew with 55 Squadron, one of the Victor units. As a co-pilot initially, he learned from more experienced crews who had been flying V-bombers for years. The Victor cockpit was cramped despite the aircraft's large size, packed with instruments, switches, and systems that all had to be mastered. Navigation over vast distances with 1960s technology required skill and constant attention. Formation flying with other Victors during exercises demanded precision. Aerial refueling, both receiving fuel as a bomber and later giving it as a tanker, required delicate control of a massive aircraft in close proximity to others. It was during his time on 55 Squadron that Kevin's career took another dramatic turn. In the mid-1980s, the RAF had retired the Vulcan bomber from operational service but kept one aircraft, XH-558, flying as a display aircraft. The Vulcan display flight needed pilots, and Kevin, by now an experienced Victor pilot, was in the right place at the right time. He was 21 years old when he was asked if he wanted to join the team. "Do you fancy flying the Vulcan?" they asked him. Kevin's answer was immediate: yes. The Vulcan was legendary. Where the Victor was graceful with its crescent wings, the Vulcan was brutal elegance, a massive delta-wing bomber that looked like it had been carved from a single block of metal. It had been the most prestigious posting in the RAF's bomber force, the aircraft that symbolized British nuclear power throughout the 1960s and 70s. And now Kevin, the lazy schoolboy from Wigan who had started in clothing stores, would fly it. The Vulcan XH-558 was special even among Vulcans. Built in 1960, it had accumulated over 7,500 flight hours during its operational career, 10% more than any other Vulcan. It had flown more missions, carried more weapons in training, survived more wear than its siblings. By the time Kevin flew it, XH-558 had been retired from nuclear duty but was maintained in flying condition to demonstrate the aircraft at air shows and public events. Flying the Vulcan was unlike anything Kevin had experienced. The Victor was large, but the Vulcan was massive. 99 feet wingspan, 111,000 pounds maximum takeoff weight, for Rolls-Royce Olympus engines producing 80,000 pounds of thrust. Yet despite its size, the Vulcan was astonishingly maneuverable. Pilots could throw it around the sky like a fighter, rolling, looping, performing aerobatics that seemed impossible for a bomber. The delta wing gave it stability and control across a huge speed range, from near stall to transonic flight. The cockpit was cramped. Originally designed as a single-pilot aircraft, the Vulcan had been modified to accommodate two pilots sitting side by side when the RAF decided nuclear weapon delivery required two crew members for the two-man principle. Neither pilot alone could arm and drop a nuclear bomb. They literally crammed 2 ejection seats into space meant for one. Kevin and his co-pilot sat shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by instruments and controls, working together to fly the massive Delta. Behind the pilot sat 3 more crew members: navigator radar, navigator plotter, and air electronics officer. These men had no ejection seats. If the aircraft had to be abandoned in flight, the pilots could eject upward through the canopy. The 3 crew members in back had to climb down through a hatch in the floor and jump. In a low-altitude emergency, they had no chance. This grim reality shaped crew dynamics. The pilots had a survival option denied to the men behind them. Kevin flew the Vulcan display flight for 2 seasons in the late 1980s. His main job was still flying Victors during the week with 55 Squadron, but on weekends he flew XH-558 at air shows across Britain and Europe. These weren't simple flybys. Kevin performed full aerobatic routines, steep climbs, banking turns that showed the distinctive Delta planform, sometimes low passes that let spectators feel the raw power of 4 Olympus engines. The Vulcan's howl became its signature, a sound unlike any other aircraft, a deep, visceral roar that resonated in your chest. Display flying was demanding work. Kevin had to push the aircraft to its limits while maintaining absolute safety margins. One mistake, misjudge altitude in a low pass, overstressed the airframe in a turn, stalled during a slow flyby, and people died. Spectacularly. Publicly. The chief engineer, Kevin Taft Stone, who maintained XH-558, admitted he sometimes almost fell off his chair watching some of the maneuvers Kevin and other pilots performed. But that was the job: show the public what British engineering and RAF training could achieve. When Kevin left 55 Squadron to train on fast jets, he couldn't continue with the Vulcan display flight. Another pilot took his place, and XH-558 continued flying until the RAF finally sold it in 1993 to the Walton family, who had a dream of keeping the last Vulcan flying. For Kevin, it seemed like the end of his connection to the aircraft. He moved on to other assignments, Tornado GR-1 and GR-4, instructing on the jet provost and 2 Kano trainers, building a career that would span 2 decades in the RAF. But XH-558 wouldn't let him go that easily. The Walton family, particularly David Walton, was serious about restoring the Vulcan to flight. It was an enormous undertaking, a complex aircraft that had been out of production for decades, requiring parts that no longer existed, maintained to standards that commercial aviation didn't demand. Robert Plemming joined the project, bringing engineering expertise. Dave Thomas, who had flown with Kevin during the Vulcan display flight days, stayed involved throughout the restoration. The restoration took years. XH-558 sat at Bruntingthorpe, slowly being brought back to airworthy condition. Systems were rebuilt, engines overhauled, structure inspected and reinforced. It was painstaking work requiring thousands of hours of effort from engineers, technicians, and volunteers. Dave Thomas kept in touch with Kevin throughout the process. "When we get this thing flying again," Dave would say, "are you still interested in flying with us?" Kevin always said yes, though privately he doubted it would ever happen. Then one day Dave called and said, "Right, we're doing the air test in 2 weeks. Are you in?" Kevin was in. By this point, he was flying for Virgin Atlantic, Boeing 787 Dreamliners on commercial routes around the world. He had to balance his airline schedule with the Vulcan restoration project, but he made it work. When XH-558 flew again after restoration, Kevin was one of the pilots. Flying a restored warbird like XH-558 was different from flying it in RAF service. The aircraft was maintained to higher standards than when it was operational. Every system perfect, every component documented, every maintenance action recorded. But it also meant restrictions. The Civil Aviation Authority imposed limits on what maneuvers could be performed, what altitudes were allowed, what weather conditions permitted flight. Kevin had to relearn the aircraft within these new constraints while still making it spectacular for airshow crowds. The chief engineer, Taft Stone, became Kevin's counterpart on the ground, the man responsible for keeping XH-558 airworthy. Taft had worked on Vulcans in the RAF since 1980, starting as a direct entry electrical technician. His first aircraft was a Vulcan at RAF Waddington. An instructor had told him during training, "This is the Vulcan bomber, don't worry, you'll probably never see it again." 40-something years later, Taft was still working on them, his entire career shaped by the distinctive Delta bomber. The relationship between pilot and engineer in display aviation is critical. Kevin pushed the aircraft to its limits during displays. Taft had to ensure those limits were never exceeded, that the airframe could handle the stress, that every flight ended with the aircraft returning safely. Sometimes they had words when Kevin performed maneuvers that made Taft nervous. But they shared profound respect born from understanding how difficult each other's jobs were. Kevin's journey from lazy schoolboy in Wigan to Vulcan pilot was improbable enough. But the fact that his flying career spanned from RAF Victor and Vulcan bombers during the Cold War to civilian Boeing 787 Dreamliners in the modern era, with the restored XH-558 in between, made his story almost unbelievable. 3. O-levels. That was his starting point. Clothing stores at St. Magon. That was his first posting. Everything that followed, the pilot training, the V-bombers, the display flying, the airline career, required him to seize opportunities and perform beyond what anyone expected from a working-class kid with minimal education. The Vulcan itself symbolized a particular era of British military history. Designed in the 1950s when Britain still believed it could be a global power independent of American support, the V-bomber force represented national prestige as much as military capability. These were British aircraft with British engines carrying British nuclear weapons. The fact that Britain couldn't actually afford this independence, that the V-bombers were ultimately redundant when Polaris submarines took over the nuclear deterrent role, didn't diminish what they represented to the people who flew and maintained them. Kevin's generation of pilots knew they were flying the end of something. By the time he flew Victors in the 1980s, the writing was on the wall for the V-bomber force. The Vulcan retired from service in 1984. The Victor soldiered on as a tanker until 1993. But the era of manned bombers penetrating Soviet airspace to deliver nuclear weapons was over. Missiles launched from submarines were more survivable, more credible, less vulnerable to Soviet air defenses that had improved dramatically since the 1950s. Yet the Vulcan endured in a way its designers never anticipated. When XH-558 flew at air shows in the 2000s and 2010s with Kevin at the controls, it wasn't demonstrating military capability, it was preserving history. The crowds who came to see it weren't defense planners assessing deterrent strategy. They were families who remembered when Britain built aircraft like this, when engineering ambition created shapes that still looked futuristic decades later, when the roar of 4 Olympus engines meant something about national capability and pride. Kevin's role evolved from Cold War warrior to heritage ambassador. Flying XH-558 in the 2000s meant explaining to younger generations what the Vulcan had been, why it mattered, what it represented. It meant performing displays that honored the crews who had flown nuclear deterrence missions, knowing they were preparing for war they hoped would never come. It meant keeping alive the memory of British aerospace achievement at a level that would never be repeated. The physical act of flying the Vulcan remained as demanding as it had been decades earlier. The aircraft was old, systems temperamental, maintenance intensive. Every flight required careful planning, weather assessment, system checks. The Delta wing's unique aerodynamics meant the Vulcan flew differently from modern aircraft. Kevin had to maintain currency in techniques developed 60 years earlier, while simultaneously flying Boeing 787s with fly-by-wire controls and digital displays. His brain had to switch between eras, between technologies separated by half a century of aerospace development. But when Kevin climbed into XH-558's cramped cockpit, strapped into the ejection seat, ran through the startup checklist, and felt the Olympus engine spool up to full power, it all came back. Muscle memory from hundreds of hours in Vulcans and Victors. The sound, the vibration, the way the aircraft responded to control inputs. The Vulcan was unforgiving of mistakes, but responsive to skill. It rewarded pilots who understood its characteristics and punished those who didn't. Kevin understood. The displays Kevin performed pushed XH-558 hard. He climbed steeply, showing the Delta planform to crowds below. He banked sharply, demonstrating maneuverability that seemed impossible for a bomber. He flew low passes that let spectators feel the sound as much as hear it, that distinctive Vulcan howl that no recording could properly capture. Each maneuver was calculated, practiced, within limits. But to spectators it looked effortless, powerful, beautiful. Taft Stone watched these displays from the ground with engineering knowledge that showed him exactly what stresses Kevin was placing on the airframe. The Vulcan was designed for this kind of flying, but XH-558 was old. Fatigue cracks were monitored constantly. Structural components were inspected after every flight. The reality of flying a 50-year-old aircraft was that eventually, no matter how well maintained, it would reach the point where continued flight became unsafe. Taft knew this. Kevin knew this. Everyone involved with XH-558 knew the clock was ticking. In 2015, XH-558 flew its last display season. Structural issues, the inability to source certain parts, and Civil Aviation Authority concerns about maintaining airworthiness forced the decision to ground the aircraft permanently. Kevin flew some of those final displays, knowing each one might be the last. The final flight came at the end of the season, one last time taking the Vulcan into the air, one last time hearing the Olympus engines at full power, one last time performing the aerobatics that had thrilled crowds for years. When XH-558 finally returned to Earth for the last time, it marked the end of flying Vulcans. XH-558 was the last one, the only one restored to flight after RAF retirement. When Kevin shut down the engines after that final flight, the Vulcan's howl went silent forever. The aircraft would be preserved, maintained as a ground exhibit, but it would never fly again. An entire era, from the first Vulcan flight in 1952 to XH-558's final landing in 2015, was finished. Kevin's career continued. He still flies Boeing 787s for Virgin Atlantic, captain on one of the most advanced airliners in service. The contrast with the Vulcan couldn't be more extreme. Composite materials instead of aluminum, digital flight controls instead of mechanical linkages, quiet efficiency instead of deafening power. But the core skills remain the same. Situation awareness, decision-making, managing complex systems under pressure. The lazy schoolboy from Wigan learned those skills across 5 decades of flying, from V-bombers to Dreamliners. Looking back at his journey, from 3-0 levels and clothing stores to flying nuclear bombers and preserving aviation heritage, Kevin represents something important about opportunity and merit. The British class system of the 1950s wasn't supposed to produce Vulcan pilots from working-class Wigan. That pathway was meant for public school boys with good connections and better education. But the RAF's meritocracy, however imperfect, created routes for talent to rise regardless of background. Kevin's success required him to seize every opportunity, outperform expectations at every stage, and never accept that his starting point determined his destination. The Vulcan itself defied expectations similarly. Designed when computing power meant mechanical calculators and wind tunnels, it remained effective for 3 decades despite enormous advances in aerospace technology. The distinctive delta shape, controversial when first proposed, proved to be inspired design that gave the aircraft capabilities its designers only partially understood. Flying the Vulcan required pilots who respected what it could do while understanding its limitations. Kevin was that kind of pilot. His story resonates because it's both exceptional and representative. Exceptional in the specific details. How many people fly Vulcan bombers and Boeing 787s? Representative in the broader pattern. Working-class kid makes good through military service, skill, and determination. The RAF gave Kevin opportunities that civilian life in 1950s Wigan never would have. But Kevin had to capitalize on those opportunities. Plenty of boys joined as apprentices and stayed in supplies. Kevin came top of his course, leveraged that into pilot training, and never stopped climbing. The lazy schoolboy label that defines his story is revealing. Teachers saw a lack of effort in conventional academics and concluded Kevin was lazy. They were wrong. Kevin wasn't lazy. He was bored, unmotivated by schoolwork that seemed pointless. When confronted with challenges that mattered to him, he worked intensely hard, becoming top apprentice, mastering pilot skills, flying nuclear bombers, keeping XH-558 flying decades after it should have been scrapped. None of that was lazy. Today, Kevin continues flying, continues sharing his experiences, continues representing the heritage of British aviation. When people ask about the Vulcan, he tells them. When airshow crowds gather, he explains what XH-558 meant. When younger pilots ask about the V-bomber force, he provides perspective they can't get from books. He is living connection between the Cold War era of nuclear deterrence and the modern era of commercial aviation, between the age of analog instruments and digital flight decks, between Britain as independent military power and Britain as heritage aviation enthusiast. The Vulcan's howl is silenced, but its impact endures. In museums, in memories, in the stories pilots like Kevin tell about what it meant to fly the massive Delta bomber. In the engineering lessons learned from keeping XH-558 flying long past its design life. In the knowledge that Britain once built aircraft that looked like the future and flew like nothing else. Kevin's journey from Wigan to the Vulcan cockpit encapsulates all of this. Ambition, opportunity, skill, heritage, loss, and the understanding that sometimes the lazy schoolboy becomes the pilot who carries history into the sky.